Thanks so much, Jason. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody out there. Thanks for joining us today. The topic today is indeed using JMeter to performance test live streaming applications, and in particular the HTTP live streaming protocol, HLS. We gave some of this content at a recent meetup here in Santa Clara, but this is I've enhanced this a little bit and added some new stuff. So if you watch that online, you're going to learn some new things here today. This is primarily focused on JMeter itself, but one thing to remember is that everything you can do with JMeter, you can do on BlazeMeter. We're 100% compatible with JMeter. We take it really seriously. It's not JMeter based, or if it works in JMeter, it works on BlazeMeter, and you can scale up and do geographic locations. So let's jump in. Here's the agenda we're going to have today. I'll do a quick intro for those of you who don't know who I am and kind of where I'm coming from, just a little bit about me, and then we'll talk about HLS itself. It helps to understand how HLS works, to understand how you would test it, and then we'll look at using JMeter in what I would call the old style, kind of building a test plan from scratch, and then using the new style, using the recently released HLS sampler plugin that we contributed to the open source. And then we'll have time for Q&A. So let's jump right in. So again, my name is Dave Caro. I'm a developer advocate, a member of the product team here at BlazeMeter, which is a CA company now. And I spent an earlier part of my career with Keynote Systems, which was a synthetic monitoring company that also had a very strong load testing offer. Not a lot of people knew about the load testing product because it was kind of consultant-led and done for really huge sites. But I've done the huge outside-in testing world and the kind of consultant-driven world. And if you look at this progression, we then became Dynatrace as part of an acquisition, and then I moved over to SOSTA, and SOSTA really was a pioneer in cloud-based load testing, real-time analytics, things that eventually became kind of expectations for everybody, but they were a leader in that space. And I realized that it was kind of a complex thing, a very complex way to do things, and developers couldn't really pick it up easily, which is what drew me to BlazeMeter, because the whole world is sort of shifting left, right? People want to be able to do testing earlier, and they also want to be able to do testing at the edges of the organization and every development team rather than just in a center. Right? I mean, you may have a center of excellence. That's great. It's good to have smart people and good tools, but you may also want to be able to do a lot more testing, and by spreading testing out, and that's really why I joined BlazeMeter. And then BlazeMeter became part of CA Technologies, and we're in what's called the continuous delivery division, where we focus on the kind of modern software factory and making it easier to ship high quality software faster. Right? So what a long straight trip it's been. It's an amazing time to be in this business. There is indeed a shift left happening, and the testing is exploding in terms of people who used to do 15 tests a year are doing 10,000 or 50,000 tests in a year, which is the way we catch things much more quickly. So let's take a look at an overview of HLS. First of all, it stands for HTTP live streaming. Let's break that down a little bit. One of the great things about it is that it uses only HTTP and HTTPS. And those of you who've been around for a while may remember Real Media. Back at the beginning of the web, if you wanted to listen to audio, let alone video, you probably had to install a plugin, and there was really a separate executable that established its own connection and played audio or video. And that required different ports to be open, and so you have all sorts of issues about secure environments, proxy servers, etc. So the great thing about HTTP live streaming is it just uses regular old little files coming from HTTP or HTTPS, right? So it's proxy and firewall friendly, and it can be served from anything that can serve HTTP. So Apache, Nginx, a content delivery network, anything that can handle web pages and pictures on web pages essentially can serve HTTP live streaming, and that helps to commoditize, helps to make it much easier and less sort of daunting to put up HTTP streams, because you're just using infrastructure you're familiar with rather than something specific and proprietary. Another thing that's critical to HLS is that it employs what's known as adaptive bit rate. And back in the old days of using early video or audio streaming, we all got used to buffering, which is sort of if there was a bad connection or something went wrong, you'd sit and wait while the screen froze or whatever, or the word buffering came up, and nobody really wants to do that. And what adaptive bitrate does is, if the connection is kind of thin, it downgrades the stream to a lower resolution audio or video so that it keeps playing, but it gets kind of chunky. And my daughter loves to watch streaming TV, and a lot of her shows will come on and they'll sort of be very, very pixelated, and then after a moment or two they get clearer. And what you're seeing happen is a negotiation between the client and the server to get the right resolution file, right? So there are multiple stream variants, and they're by bandwidth and resolution. So each, if you want to watch a particular video, it actually is maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 or more variants of the same exact video with just different level of resolution and different requirements for bandwidth for the smaller resolution files, right? The client is the one that chooses and re-chooses the best stream. I say re-chooses because remember, when sometimes you're watching something, it'll start out chunky and it'll get clearer, or the reverse can happen. And that's because it's the client, which would be just a JavaScript running in a browser, or it could be an app on a phone, is constantly sort of in a feedback loop, figuring out whether it's got the right content for the bandwidth it's experiencing. So those are the kind of key things to remember. So real basics of HLS, right? Let's look at the components of how HLS happens, right? First, there's an encoding layer, an encapsulation layer, and sometimes known as a transcoder. In the world of Amazon, this would be the elastic transcoder. And what that does is the sort of CPU-intensive heavy lifting of taking a video input and outputting an index which lists the different variants that are being created. Those are those different bandwidth versions of the video, right? And an index for each of those variants. So there's a list of the variants, and then there's a list for each variant of which segments are in that variant, and then a bunch of TS files containing each segment. TS doesn't stand for segment, it's transport stream, but also known as fragments. So the TS files, those are the very small, typically way less than a meg files that contain, think of it as just like smaller than an image on a page, right? So containing segments of the video, and they're in serial number order, and we'll see that in a minute, how that works, right? So this is the heavy lifting part, the encoding, right? Then there's the distribution and the client. So distribution can be any, as mentioned, any web server, any CDN, could be proxies involved, and then there's a client, which could be a mobile device, JavaScript, etc. And what we're going to focus on is this distribution on the client. We're not going to talk about how you choose how to transcode. We're not going to talk about, because the transcoding for video that's on demand is only really done once, and it's kind of done once and the files are laid down and you can put the files anywhere. For truly live feed, yes, the transcoder is kind of part of the pipeline, but we're not really going to stress that. We're going to stress the ability to get the streams out to the users, right? So this will be our focus. Now let's look at the flow of HLS playback at a high level. So first, we get the master playlist. So in this case, in a minute, we're going to look at a live demo, and it's a kind of about us demo video. And so the first thing would happen was the browser would go fetch this index M3U8. And by the way, M3U, this originally was a playlist for MP3s, right? And the 8 on the end means it's Unicode. So in this case, we're going to go get this index file, and we're going to parse that master playlist and look at the list of variants that's in there, and we're going to choose one. And let's assume in this case we're going to go for the low bandwidth stream, so we're going to pick the lowest resolution one in the file. And then we'll get the variant playlist that matches the resolution we chose, right? And I say we, but it's obviously the client software is doing this for us. We don't have to do anything. So in this case, we're going to get this 600K M3U8 playlist. And that file is going to contain a list of fragments, and we'll go get the first fragment in that playlist in order to start playing, right? So let's just pause for a second and just kind of get a sense of, this is really, one of the nice things about HLS, it's really pretty straightforward. It's not exactly rocket science, right? We have these index files, or playlist files, you might call them. There's a master playlist that says all the resolutions and bandwidths that are available for a feed. Then the client chooses the appropriate file for bandwidth. That gives it a list of the segments or fragments. It then grabs the fragments in order and starts grabbing 0 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, right? So if this were a live feed, what happens is there's a loop, which is that we would keep going back to get the master playlist. and the variant playlist. So if you're watching a live feed of an event happening, those playlists are being constantly refreshed because obviously you don't know the name and size or whatever of the file that hasn't been created yet, right? And so the client loops and keeps going and fetching, just going around in a circle, right? So let's take a look at what you would find inside a master playlist. And again, this is really pretty straightforward. This is human readable text, right? And in this case, we're talking about excuse me, we're talking about 4 variants. There's a 2 meg, a 1.5 meg, a 1 meg, and a 600K variant. And you can see the resolution there for each of these, right? And the bandwidth that would be needed, right? So once we grab that master playlist, we're going to decide to choose one of these. In this case, we're going to choose the lowest resolution one, right? Which is the 600K file. So the client says, oh, I need to go fetch this about demo HLS 600K M308. It does that. That's this file. So another human readable text file, right? Still nothing terribly tricky here, right? So in this case, we get a list. We get a little bit of information about the stream. We know that the targeted duration is 13 seconds. Sorry, I kind of covered it up there, but these are targeting 13 seconds per segment. And then you can see the segments are in serial order, right? So we know that the first segment is this one here. So then we would go get that segment. And that's going to look something like this. That's a bit of video that has the beginning of the About Us video and maybe leads to the agenda slide, right? So let's take a look if we were to use the BlazeMeter Chrome extension, which by the way is free. If all you need is Chrome and go to the Chrome store and grab it. Just search BlazeMeter on the Chrome store. What I did here is I went to the demo site you're going to see in just a moment, and I turned on recording. I refreshed the home page. And then I clicked on the About Us video and let it play a bit. And you can see that we downloaded the master playlist. Then we grabbed the variant playlist for the 600K. And then we started grabbing these fragments, right? And then it decided, you know what? I've got much better bandwidth than I thought. And so it grabs this faster variant playlist and the fragments for the faster variant, right? So now you probably know a little bit more about HLS than people who only know that it's the only thing Apple will serve up on its device. So now we have a good background to understand how does this flow, right? And let's do a live demo though and kind of bring this to life. So I'm going to go out of my browser, out of my presentation rather. I'm going to bring up. This is a demo site which we're opening up to the world here very shortly, and it has an About Us video we're going to see. What I want to do is I'm going to be able to watch what happens live here. So I'm going to bring up the developer tools, and I could refresh this page, and you'll see we're going to get like a lot of stuff, right? But there's stuff here that's not really relevant to what we're trying to learn today. So I'm going to put a filter in here. I'm going to look for M3U8 or, whoops, yeah, or .ts files, make that a regex, right? And I'm going to refresh the page. Now we haven't seen a video yet. Oops, let's see, did I do that? Yeah, right. We haven't seen the video yet, but look, we're getting an index file, we're getting a variant file, and we're getting the first segment. And the reason why is this site has been designed to sort of pre-fetch. So the moment I click here, I've got the video ready to play. Right now, let's press play and see what happens. And we can see those other segments that are getting downloaded. And as we go through the video, it's just going to keep grabbing more segments, right? So that's enough of that. So you can see what's happening here, right? Great. So let's go back to the slide deck really quickly here. And let's talk about kind of how you would do this the old way with JMeter and how you would do it the new way. So what you're looking here is a screenshot of a JMeter test plan. And in this case, we've created a thread group that has a once-only controller that goes and grabs the master playlist, which, again, is the list of variants, right? And in this one, we called it a chunk list. That's really just the list of the other variants, right? It extracts that list, and then does a loop, and it's going through these variants, and it's grabbing each variant file and extracting the segments from it, right? And then it's going to get the segment, to essentially play the video, right? And then it loops back around, And this one's been designed to actually kind of go through all the items in the playlist and do them, right? But you can see that this kind of takes a bunch of pieces. We have to kind of build this to think like an HLS client, and it's it's not awful, but it's a lot of moving parts, right? And this is what we have released to the wild recently, which is, in this case, you literally have an HLS sampler, and you're done, right? A single item that makes this work. So let's cruise over and have a look at what that looks like in JMeter. So here we have just a regular old thread group, right? And I've got this HLS sampler, and I'm pointing it to that master index, which was that first file that the browser downloaded. And I'm asking it to get 60 seconds worth of video at the minimum resolution, right? And then when I play this, see I have results from a prior run here. We can kind of see what's going to happen, right? So it downloads the M3. So first of all, we can look at the content here. This is the master index, and we can see in the response data that it's that list of variants, and all we did is we asked for that file, right? And we got the list of variants. And then, having chosen the lowest resolution one, we requested the M3U8 for that low resolution, and we got back a list. Sorry about this line here, it's kind of funky. We got back a list of the segment files that were in there. And you'll see that the length of these is generally, it's targeted at 13, but they're 12, 9, whatever second. It doesn't really matter. The client's going to know what to do here. And then we downloaded a bunch of those in order to have our what we wanted. I'll clear this and we'll run it again. And if we pop that open, we can see that we're getting our goodies, right? So that is really what this plugin lets you do, is to not have to think so hard about all the steps and not have to build all the logic and the loops and everything. Where again, we at BlazeMeter are about democratizing, about making it easier for more people to do more testing. And so while you could do more specific stuff with the hard approach, this approach gets you downloading and getting things working much quicker, right? But one obvious question we get a lot is what about assertions, right? So let's pop back to the deck and talk about assertions. So assertions, for those who are new, most of you probably know what these are, but an assertion basically lets you test for something and make sure that it's true or that it's not true, and throw an error if the wrong thing happens, right? So assertions can be raised against the master playlist and against the variant playlist. At this time, we're not actually doing assertions against the individual segments. They're binary data. It'd be a little trickier to do it. It could be useful, but at the moment, what we're doing is we're doing master and variant, and I'll show you how that works in a second. Some examples of what you might do would be a response assertion. And here you're looking at the text that comes back in those playlists to make sure that it's correctly formed, that it didn't get munged somehow, or that it's not the wrong file, right? Or a duration assertion. You might say, you know what, when I go back to get these files, I need them to come in at a certain speed, right? I want to make sure I'm getting them quickly. Otherwise, we could get into trouble, right? So does the system bog down under load, and is it too slow to spit these out? So when you are doing an assertion against the master playlist, you would do, here I'm doing a response assertion, right? And the key thing to here is to choose main sample only. What that's going to do is get that first M3U8 file. It's going to look through there. In this case, we're looking for a particular stream that's in there, right? And in the case of wanting to look at the variant playlist, we just have to change the selection of the radio button here to subsamples only. Now we're looking at the subsamples, the stuff that was nested under the main playlist, right? And so that's going to be the variant playlist. In this case, we're looking to make sure a particular segment is in there, right? So that pretty much covers what we wanted to do. I want to go a little further and just spend a minute kind of explaining how did this thing come to be and what is this? What is the sampler? So this HLS sampler plugin is an open source contribution that part of our team built for the world and gave away. That the source is out there. So we welcome pull requests. If there's anything you'd like it to do that it doesn't already do, or you think that something could be better about how it works, we welcome you to make a pull request. You would just go to jmeterplugins.org, search for HLS, and click on HLS sampler, and that's going to put you right in GitHub. Let's look at what I'm talking about here. So if I go to JMeter plugins and I search for HLS, there's the sampler, right? If I click here, it takes me off to GitHub, and now I'm looking at the README for the plugin, and this explains what it does, explains kind of why it's out there, and then shows you some screenshots and how you would set it up, and kind of walks you through all that good stuff. And at the very end here, we talk about, hey, there's a bit about assertions, right? And just in the matter of open source, like this information about the assertions wasn't here originally when we published this. We got feedback that it was an interesting question, and did a quick pull request to enhance the docs, right? So you get the sense of how that works. I want to, let's go back to the deck. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up the floor to Q&A right now. Hopefully you guys have popped some questions in the question dialogue ahead of time. I don't know if we mentioned that, but go ahead and do that now if you have questions. I'm going to pop these questions out here and have a look. Yes. So someone asked early on, can you show this in JMeter along the presentation? It would make more sense. Hopefully you got what you needed there when we actually went into JMeter and walked through it. And another question, has the Chrome extension been updated recently? Yes, it has. It has definitely been updated in the last year, probably twice, I would think. And then reporting metrics, great question. So what we're going to do is we're going to be able to get, let's go back here. Right, so at this point I just did a view results tree, right? But I will go ahead and add a listener here. Aggregate report, and we wouldn't do this obviously in a test we're going to run at scale, but just for really quick, I'm going to add a couple things here so you can see what's happening. Right, you might do this, for instance. Now, since I'm running at a really low scale, it's not going to be super exciting, right? But for example, in this case, and remember, I'm running this with one thread and one iteration, right? So not crazy exciting, but what we're getting, so the statistics we're bringing back are actually here are actually for the run of the entire sampler, right? So not the individual pieces, but for the entire sample, right? And if you let's go over to my example for the durations. So here's a working example of having a duration assertion. In this case, I added a duration assertion which said that this master playlist has to come back in 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds. And when I run this, because I knew it was going to come back in about 1.5, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get an error. So I would know that this is the case. If you were to run this in BlazeMeter, you would see this in the list of assertions that comes up in the portal when you run your test. Right, so you can write as many assertions as you want to look for stuff and report at it that way. Let me see. Now the questions are coming in a flood. Let's jump over and have a look. Right, so Matthew points out he would love to see a demo of load testing multiple use cases, accessing the video stream at the same time. That's a great suggestion for either another version of the webinar or a blog post or a video. So thank you for that. We have to admit, I originally built this presentation for a JMeter meetup, and I specifically didn't want to show commercial product in that, but many of you are indeed BlazeMeter users, and we could do that for you. Obviously, we built this so that you could do large-scale tests from multiple geographies, and the cool thing about the way this works is that even though I built a super simple test plan here, you could have this sampler be part of a workflow. For instance, we were looking at that web page we were in, right? The way this works, if I take this out of here, so, and I'll even turn this on so we can kind of see the timeline, and I'll refresh this page. So if I were to navigate, whoops, get that out of there. If I were to navigate through a number of these pages, bring up the About Us, or go to the cart, right? If I were to navigate around, I might want to actually have the whole user experience where you're navigating around, you're putting items in the cart, and you're then getting video, maybe you're getting video on a product detail page, etc. You would just create a test plan that would have those steps in here. You know, et cetera, right? This home page, watch a video, do something, get to the detail page, watch a video. So, and then that would let you create one sort of scenario, and you could have multiple scenarios running at the same time, all that are doing that. And you could choose to grab different feeds. Really, the options are up to you. Let's see here. Since it is open source, use with JMeter, so there's no licensing involved with BlazeMeter. So to run the plugin in JMeter would not require any licensing. Of course, we're open sourcing this, so you're free to use it in JMeter as much or however you wish. If you want to scale it up and be able to use kind of the collaborative reporting of BlazeMeter and such, you of course would use BlazeMeter in that. There are free accounts at sort of 50 user level, but for larger scale, you'd have to have that BlazeMeter account. So yes, it's open source. You're free to use it with JMeter without any licensing from BlazeMeter. Does bandwidth make any difference in response time? Well, of course it does. If your question is how would we kind of keep track? So, and would we want to impair? So, a couple things. Talking about using multiple scenarios, you may want to run this through network impairment. If I go into BlazeMeter really quick here. In BlazeMeter, you could decide that you want to deliberately impair the connection so that you are testing this experience from, say, a really bad 3G connection, right? And then all of this traffic that's going back and forth would happen at that level of impairment, and your response times reported back in the portal would be based on having to push and pull that content across that pipe. Hopefully that answers that question. Let's see. Yeah, so question here about ad insertions, I think. So actually, there's a couple questions about ad insertions. And I'll be honest, I haven't tried that out to figure out what the best way to build a test plan is to do that. I did indeed try some live sites where ads did come up. I was pretty focused on making sure that we could show how it works and how HLS works. So you're welcome to experiment a little bit. If you have questions, I do hope to get a blog post up. You could probably reply to that, or you can pop me a message afterwards. And great question. How big is the development team working on enhancements like this? I can't actually give you an answer to that because that's really something that changes over time. We believe very strongly in open source. If the question is how many requests could you make to enhance this plugin, then we should go back to the fact that it's open source, and our goal is to actually stimulate the open source community to work on projects like this. So we got this started. We will keep chipping away at it, but the goal is for people who think that that it needs to do new tricks to discuss what they are by way of doing a pull request and suggest enhancements or even produce components. And that's really, the development team is an unlimited size in that regard, which is one of the cool things about open source, right? It really is as big as the community that cares about it. A question about, is it possible to test interactive videos where a client makes interactions online? So that would depend on whether they're being actually delivered with HLS or not. If clicking on a video causes an event which fetches a different stream, then absolutely you should be able to emulate that same series of events by recording it. I would use the BlazeMeter recorder and see what's being fetched, and then write a test plan that does the same thing. And if you want to get complex and make different choices and sort of learn what it does, you could build some logic into a JMeter test plan that would kind of switch between the different scenarios and weight them appropriately, etc. Let's see here. Can we use it for MP3 calls? Great question. I don't know the answer. You're welcome to try finding an MP3 feed, and I would imagine it would work the same way because the technology is really the same sort of chunking, but give it a shot, and if it works, great, share it with us. If it doesn't, you could always suggest that as something that should be done, or take a look at whether you know how to make that happen. Do you have to take into account extra bandwidth for the load generators when testing with like 10K users? So I believe the question there is, if you're pulling a lot of video content down, do you need to be concerned about whether the load generators are capable of pulling that much content, and how much bandwidth will they need? Absolutely a concern. So one of the reasons why you would use cloud scaling, for instance, is that you don't want any of the network components or the systems themselves to be a bottleneck, right? And so we give advice in our knowledge base about kind of what you can count on for bandwidth, and you'd want to kind of do your math and figure out how much you'd want to spread the number of load generators out to make sure that you're truly stressing the origin and not the test harness. Can we get a link to this PowerPoint? I will find a way to put the slides up. I'll probably put them on SlideShare. Jason, if you wouldn't mind keeping me honest on that, we'll put the slides up on SlideShare probably later today. Can we also use JMeter for streaming MP4 videos parallelly on different devices? Yeah. Again, if you were to, you could choose a couple different ways to do that. I would say that the most reliable way to do that would be to do what we call a multi-test, which is to have separate tests pulling content across multiple devices at the same time. One test can obviously scale up. You could use one test and sort of have use a test plan that branches out and has maybe 4 different streams that it's going to pull for different devices and distribute the workload by percentages. That's kind of standard JMeter stuff in terms of how you do multiple things at the same time. Obviously, a larger number of threads running, and again, be careful on scalability. You probably want to spread it out pretty well if you're going to do a lot of that. Is there a way to measure quality in HLS video? That's a great question, and I want to be really clear that what we're doing here is reporting on the ability to serve up the segments. We're not actually doing the sort of quality of service or VoIP kind of thing people would do where you're actually rating the quality of the video. That's a different problem to solve. What you would want to do is you'd want to use JMeter to drive the volume up, and then you'd want to use a point product that does quality to actually sample the quality at some interval and see what's happening. And then there's a question about the 3 different radio buttons like VOD, which is a great question. I didn't actually explain those, right? So let's come over here. So VOD is video on demand. This is basically a static resource that has been split into segments and laid down. It's really just files that we all know about ahead of time. It's kind of the easiest scenario. Live stream and event stream handle that scenario I showed in my slide deck at the beginning, which was this business of if you're live or you're an event, really the same thing. I'll try to talk about the difference in a second. So when you are live, you have to keep looping around and getting a new playlist, right? So that the live stream and event stream affect whether we do that loop. And it's a great idea to enhance the help to explain these, because I'm trying to remember the exact difference between the live and the event, and believe that there's a minor behavior difference on the event versus the live, and I apologize, I don't know it by heart, but we will look at enhancing the help to explain that. What performance metrics such as bits per second, etc., can be fetched? Okay, so again, when you run, you're going to have this be your sampler, and then it's got a subsampler. So the data you'd be pulling it based on the sample and the subsamples, and then I'm thinking that there's probably opportunity to drill down and understand better how the TSs work we need to take that as a follow-up as well. So, and there's an off-topic question about passing a session ID from one thread to another. I'll just briefly address that and then let you know that. And thanks for apologizing in the question that it's not related. You're probably going to want to use a property for that. So I would Google that. Pass data from one thread to another. JMeter would be one way to do it. Try Googling that. You'll find that you're probably going to use a property. Properties are shared across threads, whereas variables typically are not. Let's see. If we don't have an M3U8 file, how can we generate such a file? I don't really recommend that you create one from scratch, but if you want to go to my demo site and see what's in there, you could try. Generally, the encoding layer, right, is going to generate those for you automatically, right? So this encoding encapsulation, this technology, whatever you're using is going to do that for you. It's going to create those files, right? If you just want to kind of mock it up, I suppose you could just go grab the files off our demo site and maybe make some changes if you want, but you shouldn't have to generate an M3U8 file. That comes from the process of creating the stream from the source video. What are the options of pinpointing poor performance of the stream as a through monitoring setup? So you really would watch this from both ends, right? If you have infrastructure monitoring of the system that's serving up the streams, you could certainly be watching there. And then on our side, we're going to show you how response times vary, which requests are slow, which assertions are failing. So pinpointing poor performance would be a matter of kind of watching it ideally from both ends. So, yeah, so another question about, well, what about a really long video? What would be the best strategy to test them? I think you still would do some looping because the sampler works to grab a set of video and then report on the metrics. You wouldn't want to have one sampler running on a 60-minute video. You could do that, but you'd be waiting a long time for feedback, right? Another slightly off topic, how does BlazeMeter integrate with App Dynamics? Indeed, we can fetch AppD data in real time and show it in the reports. That was the question. You would just go look at the AppD integration. What you're going to do is, I can show you in the browser really quick here. In our tests, we have this App Dynamics. If you had previously configured in one or more tests, you'd have this on a drop-down, you could just grab it, right? But the first time you do this, you'll actually put in your credentials and how to contact the server. If you have AppD inside the firewall, you would use our private location, our agent, as sort of a relay from inside the firewall out to the real world. If you have a SaaS-based option, you would just connect to it directly. And then once you've created this, you'd be able to select the metrics you want to have show up in BlazeMeter while the test is running. And you could create multiple different profiles, and those profiles would bring back metrics, and those metrics would then show up inside the timeline report, and you could toggle them on and off and overlay them on your data. So bring the questions up again real quick here. Lots of questions. Thanks a lot for so many questions, guys. Obviously, you're engaged. I appreciate it. There's a question about what scenarios can be covered for HLS load testing, and unfortunately, there's not enough detail in your question. If you want to try to clarify a little bit, I can try to address that. Let's see, and add insertions came up again, so I think that's an interesting topic. I would definitely do a recording that includes add insertions and see what behavior you see happening in the browser, and then let's talk about whether you would need to have maybe more than one sampler, have some kind of a loop or something going on in order to cause the same traffic to occur. How to know how much bandwidth will be enough to cater to X number of people streaming video at the same time. Yeah, that's, I would start with simple math, which is to, and by the way, you could run a test of say 10 and 100 and 1,000 users and look at the bandwidth that tallies up. Would be one way to start that. But basically, if you know how much bandwidth the variant is you're playing, you should hopefully get approximately that much with a tiny amount of, a little bit of overhead. So I would do some what we call calibration. I would run some smaller and mid-sized tests and observe what the bandwidth is that you're actually getting with the streams you're pulling, and use that in order to scale up. Can you show the response code of the subsampler? Sure. Okay, so here we are. We're looking at the master, sort of, and you've got all the response code information in here, right? Right. Then you've got the M3U8 file, and we see the response code here and the response message. And then for the individual files, same thing, right? So it's all there. Let's see. Can we use this plugin to do a load test for 6 hours continuously with a single manifest file? I believe the answer is yes, but I believe that the right approach to do that would be to loop, because you're probably going to want to do a sample, see how it's going, do another sample, see how it's going, do a sample. In other words, you're going to want to do lots of small samples in order to, and by the way, the back end doesn't really know any better. You're fetching individual files, right? So it's not really a session-oriented situation. So my suggestion would be to create a loop and run that test for that 6 hours in that loop, and that'll get you a lot of data. We've actually made it through all the questions, Jason. I'm pleasantly shocked, or I think I did. Let me go back and see if I missed anything. What are the important KPIs we can share with client while load testing such applications? Well, typically, obviously, response time is important, and so you're going to want to look at error rate, right? The sort of two, like, leaping to the top of the list kind of items, which is, and by the way, you know, a little bit of response time creep is probably okay. The nature of this protocol is that the client is going to kind of fetch ahead a little bit, but again, if the client perceives that the bandwidth is being constrained, it's going to downshift to lower quality video. So I would say the important KPIs are response time metrics at different load levels. Obviously, errors are a total no-no. You want your error count to be, you know, 0.0 something. So very low error levels. If you are getting errors, then you'd want to get more specific about what kind of errors are happening. But those are really the key things. You can also look at the bandwidth, and you know, when you're in BlazeMeter and you run a test. Let me see here. All right. When you run a test, if you look at the health criteria, and I don't want to do it, I ran on a sandbox. Sorry about that. If you look at the health criteria, you'll see we actually track bandwidth. Okay, so you can see here the amount of network I/O that's happening. In this case, 2980 kb per second. If you're obviously using more than one location, you have to add them up. But one way to be able to capture the bandwidth would be here. If we look in the request stats, we can see the average bandwidth across the requests. You could multiply that times the number of requests. You should be able to get a pretty good approximation of what the bandwidth is. So those are two ways to be able to report on the bandwidth. And what is the full form of TS? Not sure what your question is about the full form of TS, but there's a lot of good content actually on Wikipedia on HLS streaming. If you just start by first going to Wikipedia and look at HLS, You can drill down into the pieces. Parts of it came from, in fact, I'll just show you that live for fun here. One of them is this, the MPEG transfer stream, right? So if I go back to actually HLS, better search for HB live streaming, right? This will kind of take you from the top down and explain that it was really based upon, it actually started out this MPEG-2 standard, the MPEG-2 transport stream, and so if we go there, you can kind of learn more about how this works. Some of this is overkill in that this handles scenarios you're not actually dealing with, like multiplexing multiple different videos over a cable connection or an internet connection. That's just not what we're testing here. But you can learn more about this stuff from Wikipedia. And I think there's a question here about using the plugin to test .mss files, and I'm not personally familiar with MSS files, so if you want in the follow-up, you can clarify, or we can kind of go from there. So let's jump back in here and wrap. So in order to use this, obviously you need to have that HLS sampler in your local JMeter instance. I recommend using the plugins manager to do that, or you can go to jmeterplugins.org to grab it. Plugins manager is far and away the easiest way to do this, and if you haven't added the plugins manager yet to JMeter, you really should. It's kind of the last library file you'd have to put on your hard drive once you have the plugins manager installed, which, by the way, you can get from jmeterplugins.org. Once you install, so go to, whoops, my bad, sorry. No. Okay, great. So if you come in here and you install the plugins manager into LiveExt, then you actually get this awesome functionality where you can bring up the plugins manager. It's also available, by the way, right here, right? And the little red dot is letting you know that there's things that have upgrades. So if I go here, I can see that the plugins manager itself has been enhanced. I can see which plugins I've got installed at a glance, whether I install them with the plugins manager or by hand. And then I can see the list of available plugins I don't yet have installed, and I can learn more about them if I wanted to. Right, so the plugins manager is the way to install this, and you can see that I have, if I go here, I actually have it installed, and you can even change versions here, right? So that answers that question. And the other things I wanted to mention is that obviously accounts are free at blazemeter.com to get started with BlazeMeter. You can test at 50 users just to kind of understand how the technology works and to be able to use our infrastructure kind of at a lower scale there. That's free. All we need is literally your name and your email. That's it. Our blog has a lot of information on it. If you go to blazemeter.com/blog, typically if you're going to Google something about JMeter, there's a good chance you're going to land on our blog anyway, or somewhere else that some of our team have commented. And then at blazemeter.com/resources, there's more stuff for leading resources. Remember, there's a quick survey at the end of this webinar. We appreciate if you take just 30 seconds to answer the survey. Let us know how we can improve. I think a couple of you had ideas for what would make this webinar even better in terms of showing actually running a tested scale, etc. If you wouldn't mind mentioning that stuff in there, give a little detail, that'd be awesome. And let us know how we did. And if you want somebody from BlazeMeter to contact you about a commercial relationship, you're looking for help with a project or something, or you want to get understand the pricing at scale, there's also a chance to check a box there for that. Thank you for your time today, and hope you have a great one out there. Thanks for joining us.